In the year 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer walked into Ravenna and deposed the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire. His name was Romulus Augustulus. He was a teenager. He had been emperor for less than a year. Odoacer sent him into comfortable exile in a seaside villa in Campania and did not bother to kill him. That is the moment most history textbooks mark as the fall of Rome. And it is the wrong moment, for the wrong reasons, with the wrong villain telling the wrong story. The barbarian invasion narrative is seductive because it is simple. A great civilization, weakened and corrupt, finally overwhelmed by the force of people it had dismissed as primitive. The story has a hero, a villain, and a final scene. It fits neatly into a single paragraph. But the civilization that was supposedly destroyed by Odoacer had already been disintegrating for 300 years, and the forces that actually hollowed it out from the inside were more patient, more structural, and far more interesting than any army. Let's start with the most counterintuitive finding. The Eastern Roman Empire did not fall in 476 AD. It continued for another 1,000 years, until 1453, when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks. If the fall of Rome was caused by barbarian pressure, why did the eastern half, which faced equal or greater pressure from the Sassanid Persians, the Huns, the Avars, and eventually the early Islamic caliphates, survive for a full millennium longer? The answer is that the Eastern Empire was economically and institutionally more robust. It controlled the wealthier provinces, its trade networks were denser, its cities were more administratively coherent, its currency retained value longer. This is the first hint that what destroyed the Western Empire was not an external force, but an internal failure. Let's talk about the lead. The Roman plumbing system was extraordinary. Aqueducts, pipes, cisterns, baths. The word plumbing itself comes from the Latin plumbum, meaning lead, because Roman pipes were made of it. Lead was also used to line the cooking pots of wealthy Romans. It was used to make wine vessels, which gave wine a sweet metallic flavor the Romans actively sought. Lead acetate, known as sapa, was added directly to wine and food as a sweetener and preservative. Roman recipes describe adding sapa to sauces, meats, and fruits as a matter of routine. The Romans knew lead was dangerous in large quantities. Some ancient physicians warned against it, but chronic, low-dose exposure, the kind that kills slowly, over decades, through accumulated neurological damage, was not something ancient medicine had the framework to diagnose or prevent. In 1983, geochemist Jerome Nriagu published a paper estimating that elite Romans consumed up to 250 micrograms of lead per day from food and drink alone. The modern safe upper limit, as established by the World Health Organization, is around 10 micrograms per day. At those exposure levels, the neurological and reproductive effects would have been significant. Lead poisoning impairs cognitive function, reduces fertility, increases miscarriage rates, and in high doses causes madness, seizures, and death. Historian Deborah Davis and others have argued that chronic lead poisoning among the Roman elite contributed to the strange, erratic behavior of multiple emperors, to declining birth rates among the aristocracy, and to a gradual intellectual and administrative deterioration across the governing class. The lead didn't kill the empire on its own. But the empire's own infrastructure may have been slowly poisoning the people responsible for running it. Now let's talk about money. The Roman denarius, the standard silver coin of the empire, contained approximately 90% silver in the 1st century AD. By the mid-3rd century, that silver content had dropped to less than 5%. The coin was essentially silver-washed bronze. To put that collapse in perspective, a denarius in the 2nd century could buy roughly 4 kilograms of bread. By the late 3rd century, the same nominal coin could barely buy a fraction of that. The money had not been stolen or destroyed. It had been diluted into meaninglessness. A few percentage points of silver at a time, over 150 years of quiet fiscal desperation. The debasement happened because the Roman state had outgrown its ability to fund itself. An enormous army, a vast bureaucracy, infrastructure maintenance across a territory stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia. All of it required money, and the mines were running out. So the government did what governments under fiscal pressure tend to do. It printed more currency by putting less silver in each coin. The result was inflation. The price of wheat in Roman Egypt rose by a factor of roughly 200 between the 1st and 4th centuries AD. Soldiers demanded to be paid in goods rather than coins. Tax collectors found currency increasingly worthless and started demanding payment in kind. The commercial networks that had tied the empire together began to fragment along local lines. The economist Brian Ward Perkins, in his 2005 book, The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, documented the archaeological evidence for what happened to material standards of living in Western Europe after the empire's collapse. Pottery quality collapsed. Literacy collapsed. Long-distance trade collapsed. The size of domestic animals shrank, indicating poorer nutrition. He calls this evidence not for transformation, but for genuine catastrophe, a dark age that measurably set back human welfare across the continent by centuries. The economic collapse was not caused by barbarians. It was already happening. The barbarians arrived into a system that had already largely stopped functioning. Now let's talk about the political dimension, because this is where the story becomes genuinely strange. Between 235 and 284 AD, the Roman Empire had more than 50 different emperors. That is one emperor roughly every 10 months. Most of them were soldiers who had been declared emperor by their own armies, and then killed by the next soldier whose army declared him emperor. This period is called the crisis of the 3rd century. And it was not a crisis in the way a single bad year is a crisis. It was a fundamental breakdown of the system by which power was transferred. The mechanism of legitimate succession essentially stopped working. The imperial throne had always been unstable, but under Augustus and his successors, there was at least a fiction of legal succession, adoption, family lineage, senatorial approval. After 235, the fiction collapsed. Any general with a loyal army could take the throne, and any general with a slightly more loyal army could take it back. The energy the empire spent fighting itself during this period was enormous. Provinces were stripped of troops to fuel civil wars. Infrastructure went unmaintained. Tax collection became erratic. Administrative expertise was repeatedly decapitated as each new emperor purged the officials of his predecessor. The empire that Diocletian inherited in 284 and tried to stabilize was not the same empire that Trajan had governed at its height. The institutions had been degraded by 50 years of internal warfare in ways that no single strong emperor could fully repair. Diocletian split the empire in two for administrative reasons, and his successor Constantine moved the capital to Constantinople. Both decisions reflected the same underlying reality. The empire was too large and too broken to be governed as a single coherent unit from Rome. Rome itself had ceased to be the real center of the Western Empire by the time Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus. The actual administrative capital had moved to Milan, then to Ravenna. The city of Rome was a symbol, not a seat of power. Its population had already collapsed from a peak of roughly 1 million in the 2nd century to perhaps 100,000 by the late 5th century. The city was not sacked and destroyed in 476 AD. The last emperor was not killed. He was sent to a villa by the sea. Because the empire was not conquered, it was renegotiated. Now let's add the factor that most popular histories leave out entirely: climate. The Roman climate optimum lasted from approximately 200 BC to 150 AD. It was a period of unusually warm, stable, and wet weather across the Mediterranean basin. Agricultural yields were high, disease was less prevalent, population grew. Around 150 to 250 AD, the climate shifted. A series of volcanic eruptions, possibly linked to the 169 AD eruption of a still unidentified volcano, injected aerosols into the atmosphere and triggered a prolonged cooling period. Harvests became less reliable. The carrying capacity of the land dropped. Simultaneously, the empire was struck by two devastating pandemics. The Antonine Plague of 165 to 180 AD, likely smallpox, killed an estimated 5 million people. The Plague of Cyprian, which ran from approximately 249 to 262 AD, may have killed even more, with Roman sources describing towns entirely emptied of living inhabitants. Kyle Harper, a historian at the University of Oklahoma, has documented in his 2017 book, The Fate of Rome, how the intersection of climate instability and pandemic disease in the 2nd and 3rd centuries created a cascade of pressures that the Roman state was structurally unable to absorb. The legions that should have been defending the frontiers were dying of plague. The farmers who fed the legions were struggling through bad harvests. The fiscal system that paid everyone was already degraded by inflation. And at the top, a succession of emperors lasted on average less than a year before being killed by their own soldiers. The barbarians did not cause this collapse. They walked into it. The Visigoths who sacked Rome in 410 AD were not foreign invaders in the way Attila's Huns were. Many of them had served in the Roman military for generations. Their leaders spoke Latin. They had been settled inside Roman territory as federates, allied troops fighting under Roman command for decades. When they sacked Rome, they were not destroying a civilization they saw as alien. They were part of a collapsing system, fighting for their own survival within it. The historian Peter Heather argues in his 2006 book, The Fall of the Roman Empire, that the external pressure from the Huns, who pushed the Germanic peoples westward into Roman territory, was the genuine proximate trigger for the final collapse of the Western Empire. He gives the barbarians more credit than many of his colleagues do. But even Heather does not argue that external pressure alone explains the fall. He argues that the empire's internal weaknesses, the fiscal crisis, the political fragmentation, the demographic collapse, meant that a level of external pressure it could once have absorbed was now sufficient to finish the job. The barbarians were the last straw, but the camel had been dying for 300 years. Here is what that means. The story we tell about the fall of Rome is the story of a great civilization destroyed by an outside force. It carries a specific emotional charge. Civilizations can be killed, they can be overwhelmed, they can be taken from us. The actual story is different. Rome was not killed by an external enemy. It was degraded from within by institutional failure, fiscal collapse, environmental stress, pandemic disease, and the slow poisoning of its own elite. It was not conquered. It dissolved. And in that dissolution, something was lost that took centuries to rebuild. Ward Perkins is right about that. The pottery, the literacy, the trade networks, the material standard of living, all of these measurably declined across Western Europe for hundreds of years after 476 AD. But the cause was not the arrival of Odoacer and his men. The cause was 3 centuries of a system consuming itself. Odoacer just arrived to find the bill had already been paid, and in Campania, a teenage ex-emperor sat in a comfortable villa by the sea, watching the sea, waiting for nothing, while the empire simply stopped around him, the way a fire stops when there is nothing left to burn.